What I'm going to talk about today is large-scale Scrum and talk a little bit about a case study in which it's been used in a Polish company where I spent a year and a half or so coaching and training. I don't have permission to name the company, so I'm going to talk about it anonymously. And I might not go into quite as much detail as I would if it weren't for the fact that we're recording the session. And this one thing I learned this week is a little bit about the Polish law from Tomek regarding names and photos and so on, that you need to agree to have them used, to have them be used in public. So it's going to be a little bit opaque on the details of the case study, but I'll go into as much detail as I think I can. How many of you have already learned about large-scale Scrum and you already know about it? So maybe 5 or 10%, it looks, maybe 15%. So I'm going to go through somewhat quickly what is large-scale Scrum. I'm also going to talk about innovation games. So innovation games or serious games are often used for retrospectives. Probably a lot of you know Speedboat. You might know some other games. They can also be used for setting strategy, and that's how I use them when I'm doing a large-scale Scrum transition. And I want to share a little bit of an overview on that with you. So I'm Greg Hutchings. My Twitter tag is @ScaleAgile, and I have a company, Amelior Services, based in Paris, which is where I live most of the time. This is a picture of my daughter, Sophie. She's my #1 priority in life. She's a fantastic person. She's now 9.5, and is constantly inventing incredible things. She's also a very kind person, and I think this last week was the first time that she actually had her heart hurt by a girlfriend telling everyone about a boy that she likes. And this is the first time she's experienced this, and it's been pretty painful. So I'll be glad to see her when I get back to Paris tomorrow. This is just a little bit about my company, Amelior Services. It's been 2 years since I started the company. I had worked for ThoughtWorks, a consulting company that's well known in Agile in San Francisco, where I ran the West Coast for them. And I then moved to Paris in 2006, where I began working with Valtech. And Valtech at that time had Craig Larman, who's the co-founder or co-creator of LeSS, as the chief scientist. So I've had the pleasure of working with Craig for 10 years, and I became the first certified LeSS trainer. There now are quite a few, I think 15 of us. I don't know if I'm better than the others, I just have been doing it maybe a little longer. So I do have a lot of experience. I guess I'll mention just a little bit of the experience. So I spent 3.5 years with Alcatel-Lucent doing LeSS transformation work there for wireless and fixed access products. The largest had 10,000 developers for the 4G LTE product and 1,000 system testers in 40 countries. So 200 million lines of code, a very, very large product. And I've worked with smaller products also, but I've specialized in large and complex product development and trying to simplify and descale organizations rather than make them more complex. So large-scale Scrum has layers to it. So in the center are principles. There are 10 principles, and that's the core. It has then 2 frameworks. They were initially called Framework 1 and 2, not really very sexy. So they decided to call them less and less huge. And maybe that's better, but the confusion is that less is the overall body of knowledge, and it's also Framework 1. So the simpler version of less is just called less. There are then guides, and the guides came out only recently when the 3rd book on less was published, and I have a copy of it here. The 3rd one is also the smallest. The other 2 were big, hefty books. And this is a little lighter, a little easier to read. So if you want to read more about LeSS, I'd get the 3rd one and start with that rather than the first 2 that came out in 2008 and 2010. This came out this year. The LeSS Works website is also a great place to learn. Most of the content in the book is on the website, so you can learn a lot just from navigating the website. After the guides are experiments, and there are 650 experiments in LeSS. Experiments are not prescriptive. It doesn't mean you have to do that, but if you have this problem, you might try this, or if you see this situation, avoid doing that. That's the format of the experiments. So what is LeSS? This is the basic framework, the LeSS framework. And what you see is there is one product owner, even though in this case there are 3 teams. The basic LeSS framework works for 2 to 8 teams. Those are in the best conditions where the product owner can really scale to 8 teams. I often find it's about 5 teams that work well for one product owner. Within the sprint, you have sprint planning 1, sprint planning 2. Then you have a sprint of 2 to 4 weeks. Some people are doing it with 1 week sprints. The group I worked with in Poland was doing 1 week sprints for 6 months with 8 teams, and it was working quite well for them. So the sprint starts on the same day and ends on the same day for all the teams, and you have a joint meeting. So sprint planning part 1 is all the teams together with the product owner looking at one product backlog, and they're picking items that they're going to work on in the next sprint. Usually there's a kind of round robin. There's a way to fairly distribute the work among the team members so that everyone has a chance to do something interesting. You then have, during the sprint, daily stand-ups, daily Scrum meetings, as you would normally in Scrum. And you have some coordination that is directly between people. Scrum Masters, there's usually 1 to every 2 or 3 teams in a LeSS setup. And then during the sprint, you have product backlog refinement. And that's the kind of grooming process that most of you know, I'm sure. It's especially important, the larger you get, that you have very clear items that any team could work on, because one team might analyze it and another one might work on it. So you want to be sure that you have good specification by example, good acceptance test-driven development, something that is very clear to anyone who will read it. At the end of the sprint, you have a sprint review, and you look at one potentially shippable product increment. And so the whole team all the teams are working together to produce one version of the product. Each team then has a retrospective, and after that, there's an overall retrospective. The only meeting that is new compared to Scrum, basic one-team Scrum, is this overall retrospective. And representatives of teams come together and discuss what's not working well overall in our system. What do we need to do to remove impediments that are affecting all of us? So that's the LeSS framework. You then start the next sprint. If you have questions at any point, yeah, go ahead. I was anticipating that.
You mentioned the difference between sprint planning 1 and the overall retrospective, because you said every member got to the sprint planning 1, so whole teams.
Yes,
And only a couple of members to the overall retrospective, correct?
That was a good catch. No, it's actually not prescriptive. So what most teams normally do is everyone comes to the sprint planning part 1, everyone comes to the overall retrospective, and I was getting ahead of myself because over time, most groups decide too many meetings, I don't want to be in all these meetings, so teams self-select representatives. So either meeting might go to a representative mode earlier. Anyone is always welcome to every meeting, so there isn't a closed door policy, but there is an efficiency issue for some people who would rather not be going and are comfortable with a representative. When you have representatives, you want the team to pick their own representative and not have it be enforced by some management or always the same person. Otherwise, you end up with bottlenecks of communication. Thanks for observing carefully. Any other questions before I go on? Yes.
I have a question. Who is then responsible for reuse of the solutions between the teams? For example, one team has some good solution which can be reused by the second team. When we should spot the situation and gain benefit from that.
Well, teams are responsible for the reuse of code because teams write code and consume code. In terms of how to encourage reuse, if that's part of what you're concerned about, communities of practice are helpful for that. And unless we encourage communities of practice and transparency between teams. So those two things may help. But there's a classical question. When I was actually talking to Alcatel-Lucent at the beginning, before they decided to hire me and a group of about 35 coaches to do the work there, they said, tell me about the trade-off between agile and reuse. And so it's a good question. I think there's always a dynamic between the two. Sometimes people become so concerned about reuse that it's actually much slower than if they were to create duplication. On the other hand, duplication creates cost, and you have a need to refactor. So I think there's usually an orthogonal relationship to microservices, refactoring, clean code in an organization that is also adopting Agile. And you can govern it to some extent in addition to team natural collaboration by encouraging it from the product owner level. So encourage practices, encourage taking time, avoid putting pressure on teams so that they not only do reuse, but they also do clean code. Oop. So this is less huge. And less huge can scale up to many hundreds or thousands of people. It looked like you're concerned. Is it hard to read? It might be a little hard for you to read this, and if it is, I'll try to walk you through it. But basically, this is an example of less right here. And we have another less and another less, so it's basically 3 less frameworks together. And the only difference here is that we've added now a new role, the area product owner. We have the product owner and the area product owner. We have still one product owner for the entire product, and the product owner has become overwhelmed by the number of teams and the amount of requirements and the amount of work to do, even though the teams were already helping her in the framework 1. They were helping her to do refinement, they were helping her to do clarification, writing items or stories, but it's just now it's too much. So you scale up to framework 2 or less huge by creating a team of product owners. Each area product owner is facing the teams in her area as though she were the product owner. So that's who they see at every sprint planning and every sprint review. The area product owner meets with the product owner before the sprint starts, and they align on overall priorities in the product backlog. There is a view of the product backlog that's filtered for the area, so it appears to be a separate backlog, but it is not separate. It's the same physical table that's been filtered, so you might have consumer, B2B, and partner domains or areas. The areas are business-centric. They're business-centric so that the area product owner can directly interact with customers in the market, and you don't lose a sense of business imperative when you scale up. During the sprint, each sprint planning meeting is held separately by the area product owner, and at the sprint review, you're reviewing that area. Now, what the company I worked with in Poland did, and some others have done also, is they add a layer of an overall sprint review across all the areas, and an overall sprint planning across all the areas is a short meeting to get a complete view altogether of where the teams are going. It's really a question of how many teams. So the example I was mentioning, there were 8 teams. It wasn't too hard to get them together. If you have 80 or 800 teams, that might become difficult or not very meaningful. So hopefully this is clear. Do you have any questions about the less huge framework as it's published? So let's go on and talk a little bit about, yes?
Are you speaking about a single project, or it's a group of projects, like a program?
It's nothing to do with projects or programs. It's product development. And in general, I'm not a big fan of projects or programs. I think it's better to try to eliminate that concept and think about a product and the market you're building it for. Projects have a beginning and an ending, which may have nothing to do with the product, its product's life cycle. And the product is what customers use. And the product is what we develop. So one problem with project and program mentality is, from a financial standpoint, we fund and we defund things based on priorities from the business. And we disband the team that was on the project because the project's over, and they go and they work on something else. And you lose all of the tacit knowledge and team dynamic that had been valuably created at some expense to then start another project with maybe different people You have another whole ramp-up period of several months to 6 months before people become comfortable working together and efficient. So in LeSS, we really encourage long-term, cross-functional, co-located feature teams as a basic building block of the organization, and that these teams pull work that is the next most important work, whether it's on one product or possibly a new product, but to avoid dismantling and disbanding a team just because of a project mentality. So I'm not picking on you I'm glad you asked the question because it gave me a chance to say that. And I realize that many companies make financial decisions and dispense money through projects and programs, but I think it's a root cause problem of a lot of organizational instability and difficulties that people have finding value in their work. We really relate to a small group of people best, like a family. And when you have a team that holds well together, the last thing you want to do is really break it apart.
But still, in the run, trying to maybe put it in place, will be organization with scrums, with programs and projects.
Mm-hmm.
So the approach of LeSS would be to go fully or not go at all?
The approach of LeSS is to go deep and narrow rather than broad and wide, and to have a meeting at the beginning, which I'll get to in a minute, called informed consent. So if you're a coach or you're an executive or you're a stakeholder in a company and you're considering making a change to improve things, you get together, you study what LeSS is or some other options you might have, and then you decide which direction you want to go based on trade-offs. So it usually takes some time, you need to invest some money, you'll get some benefit. The question is the benefit worth the time and the money? Can you be intermediate to long-term in your planning? Or are you short-term and you're fighting to keep up with an overwhelming number of things that are maybe the part of the problem, but you're just not ready to make such a big change? So this is the website address for LeSS Works, and you can find it a lot more here. Each of the graphics is navigable, so you can click on them and you'll get into a lot more detail. And what about completeness? So some of you might know about other scaling frameworks. SAFe, for example, has become fairly well known in the last few years. There's a guy I know who has a company called Digital Tango who's done this analysis, and he's looked at SAFe versus DAD, Disciplined Agile Delivery from Scott Ambler, Scrum at Scale, LeSS, the Spotify model, which isn't really a framework, but people talk about Spotify and want to emulate them. Nexus, which is fairly similar to LeSS, and then Scrum of Scrum. And on the bottom is flexibility, and on the side is completeness, or covering. How well does it cover the topics? And according to Etienne from Digital Tango, he feels SAFe is the most complete, and that LeSS is one of the most flexible. And it's the most complete of the very flexible options. So what I like to do is combine LeSS with innovation games, and I believe that combining the two, you can be as complete as SAFe and much more flexible. And I think flexibility is key. There's an expression that we like to use as LeSS trainers: you should own, not rent, your methodology. What we mean by that is you should make it your own. You should adapt it to your context. You shouldn't install something and expect it to work out of the box exactly like it works everywhere else. That's really pretty simplistic. And the larger the organization, the more deep your culture is, and the more likely you're going to need to think about how to fit it into that organization. So it means it's a little harder, but to do it well, you need to spend the time to understand the context in an organization. So these are the principles. I'm not going to go into detail on them right now, but if you just take a look at the 10 principles, the first is that large-scale Scrum is Scrum. The Scrum Alliance has taken a very positive position on LeSS and quite a negative position on SAFe. So much so that the Scrum Alliance has said that if you're a certified Scrum trainer, you cannot teach SAFe. And if you teach SAFe, you'll no longer be a certified Scrum trainer. So the Scrum Alliance is very disturbed about SAFe. I have to say I'm somewhat disturbed about it also. I've used it, I've been trained in it a few times. I feel like while it has some advantages, certainly better than not doing any kind of Agile at all, it has quite a few disadvantages, and that's among them are that you don't change existing management. There's a lot of hierarchies in SAFe. There are a lot of queues. There's a long cycle time of a PI planning of 5 sprints. The PI planning event has each team commit to 4 sprints worth of work on items that they probably haven't seen until that event. So I believe it does a lot of pressuring and potential damage to team reputations, and doesn't understand some of the basic things in Scrum, which have been lost in SAFe. So I really prefer LeSS personally, but I respect people who decide to do something differently. LeSS has been a lot less well marketed, and it seems a little more difficult because you have to think about the context. And so SAFe is being adopted fairly quickly and somewhat naively, I think, by companies that I expect will probably, a certain percentage will come over to LeSS after a year or two. So innovation games. Innovation games are a form of serious game. Luke Holman, who is a friend of mine and someone I've worked with for many years, created a company and a website called innovationgames.com. He wrote a book called Innovation Games. And these are a few of the games that he's invented or that he's found from others and he's publicized. And the colors are a little odd on the projection, but I hope you can see this is kind of a boat. This is a speedboat exercise. Have you done a speedboat before? Does everyone know what a speedboat is? Looks like maybe quite a few people might not have done it before. The idea of a speedboat is that you draw a boat, and the boat represents your product. You can do a huge one on a big poster on the wall, or you can do a smaller one. But you use a wall normally, and you show the water. And a boat. And the boat represents usually your product or your organization, the fact you're trying to go somewhere, you're trying to go quickly. But unfortunately, some things are slowing you down. And these are anchors. Some of them are bigger than others. And you facilitate a group of people to identify what are those anchors that are slowing you down. And then as a group, you identify actions that will cut the cable and you then plan these actions in your next sprint or in your next release process to see how can you improve the organization and remove impediments. Another variation for the speedboat is sometimes you say, well, if we had a really high-powered motor, a jetpack on the back of the boat, what would that be? What would it look like? And maybe that would be something we need to do to make things go faster, to make them go better. And you sometimes also define an island with a palm tree on it maybe, some coconuts. We want to go towards that island, and that's our vision. What does the vision look like? And discuss where it is we're really trying to go. So any kind of innovation game will involve a visual metaphor, play, a limited time, some rules, an objective, and an outcome. And the outcomes are usually actionable. And when people play, they interact in a way that they don't interact when they're sitting in an audience and listening, or sitting around a meeting room table. When they go to the wall and they play something that's fun, and they find more creative ideas, and they tend to work together more collaboratively. So I use them a lot, and I also teach innovation games. There's a second one here, which is a vision. What's your product look like if it were a box of cereal in the store? What would the image be? What would the name be? What would the price be? What are some selling points? What are some warnings on the back of things that you might not know about, but you need to know before you buy it? So Vision Box helps people to envision their product clearly and arrive at a shared vision as a group. Then there's an interesting game called Buy a Feature, and in Buy a Feature, you help the product owner determine which parts of the product backlog should be built and which parts should be de-scoped. We almost always have more that we want to do than we have time, and the Buy a Feature game is a great way to get rid of scope that is least attractive. There's an online version of each of these games. And there's a website I can direct you to if you want to sign up for a free trial of those. I use them quite a bit. So in the case study in Poland, we did a 600-person retrospective using the online innovation games platform on 2 topics. One was, what are the things holding back your teams? What are your impediments using a speedboat? And the second was a game that we developed, that Luke actually developed, for that retrospective called Curve Jump. There's a technology adoption curve where companies start out with something at the beginning, then over time it gets more mature, and after a while it's out of date and people begin to abandon that technology. So we played an online curve jump game with 600 people to have people talk about what are the technologies we're using today, which do we think are mature or getting to be too old, and what are some ideas we have that would be totally new or incrementally new, and collected all of that in a database, and then we had a harvest of innovation and knowledge from a large number of people. So it's a very useful and agile way to get high levels of collaboration in large groups so that everyone has a voice and all ideas are considered, as opposed to a small number of people making decisions for everyone else. Maybe they would like to consult them, but they can't figure out a way to do it. This is a little bit more about innovation games. I'm going to skip over this for the moment, though. And this is the website you could go to if you want to look more at them. You can play them either in person, which is always preferable if you can do that, but sometimes you have thousands of people or hundreds of people, and you can't possibly get them all together. And so an online platform has been created that lets you scale up. So one way I use them is in LeSS with product road mapping. And the class I just taught, we spent half a day going into detail on product road mapping using innovation games. So here I'm going to just mention it briefly. I think it's a fantastic thing to do, and it counteracts one of the problems with Agile at a small or large scale that I've seen, which is that people tend to lose track of the longer term vision and roadmap. When we're doing 1 or 2 week sprints or 3 week sprints, we're focused kind of in a tunnel on the next sprint and what we need to do. And it's nice that we're not doing too much upfront planning. It's nice that we're flexible and able to go in a new direction. But some teams complain of the fact they don't really know what the vision is anymore. They don't know where they're going. And and the business might actually lose track of its strategic direction. So finding a reasonable balance where you spend a little time thinking about the longer term, a lot more time on the shorter term, and then you iterate and go back and think about the longer term, maybe every quarter, tends to work pretty well for me. So I usually suggest with clients to do a product roadmap workshop of 1 or 2 days every quarter. It involves the product owner, the teams, stakeholders, sales, marketing, people who might be in operations or customer service. You get everyone together in a large room, and you play a number of games. So the first one here is take the items, the high-level items for the backlog, and plot them value versus effort. If it's high value and low effort, it makes a lot of sense to do it. If it's a lot of effort and low value, maybe you can start to throw them out already. So you take some items that are low value and high effort, and maybe you put them in a little graveyard. You bury them. So you already managed to get rid of some things that really should never be developed in the first place. And then prune the product tree. You represent the future of your product as a tree. And the first 6 months are low on the tree, then the next 12 months in the middle of the tree, and beyond 12 months to maybe 18 months are at the top of the tree. And people together move the apples or the leaves around on the tree until they get comfortable that this is the right balance of short-term, intermediate, and long-term. So it helps you start building a roadmap. This is looking at, this is called competitive target. You're looking at what your customer wants, what you offer, and what your competitor offers. And you can look at the intersections, and when you have something the customer wants and your competitor doesn't, you win. And when your competitor has something the customer wants and you don't, you lose. And when everybody has it and the customer wants it, you fight. So it helps you figure out competitively where should you focus in the coming months to build more winning situations, to defend better when you're fighting, and to think about the customer. You can also start to get rid of things that nobody wants. You built them, but they were just useless. So the last one is innovation ambition that I've shown here. And this is looking at how you win and where you play. Where you play are the markets you go to. This is your current market and your current technology. Here we've gone to an adjacent technology. So let's say we're going from mobile to tablet or desktop to tablet. And here we have something totally new technology. Here we have a totally new market. Let's say we're B2C, we go to B2B or small business, and now we go to governmental markets, totally different market. And you can measure the percentage of your portfolio for the next year or 18 months that's truly innovative. Why is it important to do that? Studies show that companies get 80% of the return from 20% of the investment for truly innovative work. And many companies get drowned by all of the things they have in the backlog that are not innovative, but just continuous change requests. So it helps you get rid of things that you can live without and focus on things that might really differentiate your business. When you first begin in LeSS, you do some initial product backlog refinement. So you can use games for that as well. This is a little clarification on the difference between the product owner, the customer, and the team, and who communicates to whom. In traditional one-team Scrum, often the product owner is the single point of contact for the customer. The team gets all of the requirements from the product owner. The product owner prioritizes them, writes them, clarifies them. It ends up becoming quite a bit of handoff, which is a lean waste, and potentially some delay, and the product owner becomes the only one who really understands the customer very well. In LeSS, what we try to do is instead have the product owner control prioritization, but open up communication directly with the customer or requirement owner for the team. So you have more bandwidth with the customer, more sources of question, more sources of clarification, and a better intimacy of the customer. So I hope that's clear why we would do that. Some product owners might feel threatened by that scenario, but they can be reassured because they maintain control over the prioritization. They don't lose control, but they get help from the team. And that's critical for the product owner to be able to scale to many teams. So in sprint planning, you have sprint planning part 1 and part 2. In this case, we're looking at team representatives because the teams have decided to send representatives. We could have everyone in that meeting, sprint planning part 1. And in part 2, teams are going into tasks, maybe doing some design work, talking about dependencies, and creating a sprint backlog and a sprint burn down, a task board. So, sprint review, we have the product owner there. It's nice to have the product owner actually do the sprint review, and then retrospectives by team and the overall retrospective that I mentioned before. This overall retrospective might be done in an open space. It might be focused on system level problems. So we don't need to go through every problem of every team at the overall review. What we want to, overall retrospective, we want to look at what are problems that we all share. What are some things that would help us all if we solve them? And you often use a kind of systems thinking tool called causal loop diagramming. Does anyone know that technique? I know some people do. From Tomek already knowing it, he's on the pathway to become a LeSS trainer also, and people who've been in my class also know that. So what you do with a causal loop diagram is you model together with a group of people a problem that is a wicked problem, a kind of a hairy problem. Like it could be that your goal is to reduce global warming. Everyone knows it's a pretty bad problem. So the first thing you do is you set your goal. You invite the people together who are going to work on the problem. This is a causal loop diagram, that example I'm going to show you. And with the goal in mind, you think about what are the variables in this system. So you might have, for example, the average annual temperature. And the temperature goes up or down based on other factors. So you could have another variable, which is the percent CO2 in the atmosphere. The more CO2 in the atmosphere, the higher the average annual temperature, right? So we show an arrow and a cause and effect relationship. Now, the higher the average annual temperature, the more there will be evaporation. So we could look at water vapor, atmospheric water vapor. The higher the temperature, the more the vapor. We might also think about plant growth. So what's the biomass? What's the either it could be the trend of biomass going up or down, or just the total tons of biomass on the earth. So the more biomass we have, the less CO2, right? Because plants create oxygen and consume carbon dioxide. So in this case, we have an opposing relationship. The more biomass, the less CO2. And the more water vapor, probably the more biomass. Plants like a certain amount. Although if it's too much, they'll get mold and they'll die. So you have a minor relationship in the other direction if it's too much. You can now see a loop, and you can see whether the loop is reinforcing or balancing. So in systems dynamics, in causal loop diagramming, you have balancing and reinforcing loops. And once you understand the system, and this is a very big simplification of the system, you can then begin to think about actions that will affect the average annual temperature. So if we have more biomass and less CO2, we should have a lower temperature. So this could be an action, plant trees. So you might identify an action that would help reduce global warming. Or the percentage of people that ride a bike instead of drive a car. Because if we make some more variables in this systems thinking causal loop diagram, we'll be able to see the effect of driving a car versus riding a bicycle. And in fact, the more you drive cars, the more you need to build roads, which means you will have fewer trees, which means you'll have more global warming. So people who are in a violent disagreement about a subject like that subject, or why did Trump win in the US, a lot of people are very upset about that, including me. But getting angry doesn't necessarily help solve the problem unless you understand the system. It's difficult to find actions that might reduce the risk of that happening. So that's a little digression from just the pure LeSS processes to systems thinking, which is one of the 10 principles of LeSS, perhaps one of the most important ones. So learning about LeSS is really not a matter of memorizing a couple of frameworks. That's pretty trivial, pretty easy thing to do. It's a matter of learning how to learn differently as a group and helping a group of people think differently. It's really very much about thinking tools. The first book on LeSS is called Large Scale, Agile, and Lean, and the subtitle is Thinking Tools. And the whole 400 some pages is around thinking differently. So if you want to get more into LeSS, and you want to learn about it, basically read this book, but then go back to the first book in 2008 and you'll find a lot of deep information about how to think differently. Unless we have coordination, and there's a simple mechanism for that, just talk. It's the best coordination mechanism. Communities of practice I brought up before, I think everyone knows about them already, but they're very important to plan in a LeSS adoption. They can have appointed or volunteered leaders. I prefer volunteered leaders. Open space technology. How many you probably have done some open space conferences in this group, I imagine. Have you done them? Everyone knows about open space? Does anyone not know about open space? All right. Okay, well it's good that at least one of your friends here can tell you more about it. I'll talk about it briefly. Just the idea is you get everyone together who would go to a conference, and instead of having an organized speaker like I'm speaking today, anyone can propose a topic. You take all the topics, you list them, you slot time into several sessions, and then you have several locations in the open space conference, and people put topics into rooms at times, and then if you're interested in that topic, you go to that room at that time and you discuss it. Normally in an open space conference, you then harvest at the end of the session some takeaways, and you might read them back at the end of the day or put them on a wiki, somehow communicate them to people. But it's a great way to have a self-organizing large group of people share time valuably on topics that they enjoy. Software craftsmanship. LeSS also emphasizes good technical practices. These are a few that you probably are familiar with. Refactoring, test automation. In the roles in LeSS, there are 5 relationships, and they are based on 3 roles. So team, product owner, scrum master. The product owner is interacting with upper management, getting funding, getting support, getting feedback, clearly with teams and with customers. And the scrum master is making sure that overall the relationships in the system are working smoothly. Teams and customers in LeSS interact directly. So you can see the dotted line at the bottom. And the scrum master helps ensure that the product owner is opening up communication between the team and customers. There's a game in most product development organizations that you probably are familiar with. But in case you're not, I'm going to briefly explain this game to you. It's called the win-lose contract game. And the way it goes is like this. You have, first of all, a project or a product or a need of some type. And that's usually represented by someone from the business or management, product owner, who comes along and says, I want more of something. I want more features, I want more products, I want something. And on the other side, you have IT or R&D, and they're already quite busy. And so they play the second move in the game, and they say, LeSS. We already have too much work. We're overloaded. We don't have enough people. We have technical debt. We have to resist. Over the time from the request until the end of the project or the end of the product development, when everything is done, there can be quite a bit of time spent in this argument where there is more pressure and more pressure. If you don't do it, we'll outsource it. We'll find someone who can. We'll fire you. We'll make you do terrible, boring work if you don't do it. And there's more and more threats that come back from the other side. Do you want the system to crash? If we don't take care of it, it will crash. In fact, I might delete some of the code because it's so crappy I'm ashamed of it. I know people who've done that. In some cases, a lot of code. It can be pretty bad. So what's the solution to this terrible argument? At some point in time, in the win-lose contract game, somebody else comes along, a program manager or project director. They say, look, everybody, calm down. You're having a terrible fight. I'm going to save the day. I'm going to solve the problem. I'm a release train engineer. I don't know if you know about SAFe, but there's a release train engineer. They wear a special hat. I'm going to solve the problem. I promise you that we're going to have this scope on this day with good quality. The budget will be under control. If not, I can be sacrificed. And everyone goes, oh, thank God. Now we know who to blame if it doesn't work. And instead of fighting anymore, now we're going to go talk to the release train engineer and see what do they say. You know, so there's some effects of this game. It feels good that you now have someone to blame. You can go golfing or start investing in some new technologies or do some other things. But you need to communicate in Agile for things to work well, right? Once you have this person, what happens to the customer and IT's communication? Does it go up or does it go down? Is their communication better or worse now that you have this, this role? It goes down normally because you go to the release train engineer instead of talking directly, so there can be a delay, there can be a distortion. And in terms of your control on the business side, now that you have this, this contract, a win-lose contract, your control goes down quite a bit. So now you want something changed. I'm sorry, we already have an agreement. We're not going to consider that. And the trust tends to go down because now you don't know really what's happening anymore. You go to ask what's happening, they say, well, talk to the release train engineer. We're busy. Okay, well, ask the release train engineer, how's things going? Everything's fine. Everything's great. Like I told you before, I'm going to get it done on time, there's no problem. So the trust goes down, and when the trust and the control and the communication go down, the flexibility and collaboration go down. So there's a lot of problems in injecting a new role between two parties. When two people are communicating, it can be quite intimate. When you have an intermediary, it becomes less intimate and there's sometimes distortion. So unless we do not have a release train engineer role, we get rid of that or avoid ever having that role. And we avoid having this event where you fix the scope, establish penalties, make a commitment, and you maintain continuous responsibility on the PO to do the best possible with what we have. And so if the estimates were wrong and they were overly ambitious, the product owner descopes. It's not the fault of development. Estimation is difficult. It's almost always wrong. We know that. So why pretend it isn't? We know it is almost always wrong. And it changes. So if you want to adopt Agile for flexibility and change purposes, avoid having the contract of committing to a certain scope on a certain date by the teams, and let the product owner own the trade-off between scope, time, money. Maybe you can deliver early, maybe you can deliver on time, less scope, maybe you will deliver later because it's the better outcome, but you let the business decision be made by the business representative who is the product owner. And you don't blame the team for things outside their control. This is just a delegation of responsibility, so a product owner is not monitoring the progress of the team is self-monitoring, unlike a traditional project manager. So a little bit about structure in a LeSS organization. Some advice is not to create distributed teams, dispersed teams. If you have a team, it's better for the team to see each other every day, be co-located, interact through facial expressions, much more productive than interacting through email or even Slack. On the other hand, if you're multiple site, each site can have complete co-located teams. That works quite well. And if you're concerned about where the product owner is, you could have a product owner on site A who is able to visit site B and still have plenty of good communication. So it's okay normally to have the product owner on a different site than some of the teams if the product owner is willing to travel to those teams and see them directly. So about adoption, when you adopt LeSS, you need to consider both bottom up and top down. You need to have good support from an organization. There will be some big changes coming if you adopt LeSS, changes to roles, a flatter structure, maybe even movement between sites of people. There will be a change into how communication is done with customers interacting directly with teams. But you also need bottom-up support so that people can volunteer to be involved rather than being forced to. So normally you choose a part of the organization and you announce that you're going to do this, and people who are interested are able to join that. There's another form of freedom that's quite important that I like to facilitate called a team self-design workshop. And the idea here is that you bring people together into a common room. You say, look, we're going to reorganize into cross-functional feature teams. We've set up chairs in 8 areas where there'll be 8 teams, and you can go choose whichever chair you want to sit in, up to the limit of the size of the team. And people design which team they're going to be on, they name themselves, they become a new team, and it's an incredibly positive thing to do. I totally love facilitating it. It predictably will help people feel a lot better about who they work with and their ability to decide. So when you get started with LeSS, you want to have an informed consent meeting where management gets together and discusses what the consequences will be, what the cost will be, the time involved, where they'll be physically located, and decide whether to do it or not. If management doesn't decide to do it, I don't recommend doing it just on your own and hoping it'll work out. LeSS is a pretty important decision, and you need top-down support. I tried when I was younger to, in kind of a revolutionary way, change things frequently without management support, and you get beaten down quite a bit in doing that. It's possible to get management on your side, and I think it's a better thing to do if you can do that. You educate everyone so they know what the terminology is, what is LeSS, what's a product owner. You define what the product is. So in a project or program management environment, sometimes people don't have a very clear idea of what is a product and what is not. And you need to decide that for product ownership and backlog management reasons. Having appropriately structured team means teams that are able to deliver value independently. So if you have a component team structure currently in 5 components and 5 teams, you might mix them up so that each team can work on all or some of the components. You make sure that no one but the product owner gives work to the teams. You define definition of done and definition of ready, so you have some common working agreements between the teams. That's important. It's important for teams to define something that they can actually do and not have it be a wishful thinking. So it has to be something that teams agree are reasonable, and to keep project managers away from the teams. A few preparations. Starting the COPS up, initial refinement, making sure you have the right version control and build systems in place. Agree on a definition of done together that people can agree is doable. Moving people together, providing good working spaces. They may not have an appropriate workspace, so you may need to change the workspace. And then set up an organizational impediment service. And what this is a Kanban, for example, where once or twice a week management comes and looks at the problems that teams have had that they can't solve, and the team members bring them and put them on the Kanban board, and the management in front of other people take on the items that are blocking teams and identify what they can do to solve the problem. So it's a servant leadership approach, getting management very involved. And that's part of the informed consent meeting is, you would like to improve your organization. Are you willing as executives to personally be involved in improving things? Because if you want a free lunch, there is never a free lunch. It won't get better unless you also are involved. So this is one of the things that I do a lot of is executive coaching and management coaching to get them to become involved in effective change. So a short synopsis of the case study in a Polish fintech that I worked with. The problem was that the teams and sites were unaligned with each other and unaligned with sales, customers, and management. So this group had adopted Scrum on a team level, and they were actually quite good at doing Scrum on a team level. So every team had a product owner, a Scrum master, they were co-located, they liked each other mostly, and they were developing items in a backlog for that product owner. But between the product owners, there wasn't very much coordination, and for management to understand what was happening, they had to go talk to 10 different product owners, and it wasn't clear what the strategy was in either direction. It wasn't clear what the vision was. And it wasn't scaling very well, and the company was trying to grow quickly and had a lot of demand, but it just wasn't able to respond quickly to customer needs. So the approach was to transform the group using lesson innovation games, and I led that transformation. We set a new strategy for the group in terms of products and markets, a new organizational design, much flatter, removing some managers, centralizing people in a single site, and then creating areas. We used less huge, 3 business-centric areas that were managed by 1 product owner and 3 area product owners. I spent a lot of time training and working with the product management side to do a good job in that area, and they did do a very good job. Then to create a clear direction for everyone through a roadmap workshop. So we planned out the next 18 months in a roadmap, and we established a cadence so that all the teams started and ended their sprint on the same day with a single potentially shippable product increment. And we experimented. We had some difficulties. We made some adaptations. We did overall group retrospectives to figure out how everyone was doing. We involved human resources, finance, sales, customer service, operations, technology, product management. So we involved the entire organization in this transition, not just the IT group. And the results were, and still are, a shared focus for the group. They're more agile, so they can change direction quickly. You know what it means to be agile? I mean, being agile means you can change direction quickly, inexpensively. And so they're able to do that. They collaborate much more, better transparency. People are happier for the most part, and the faster time to market. So I feel like it's been successful for them. They're continuing to do very well financially. And some key elements of success, creating and sharing a vision for change. It's a little hard to read that color of print, I think. Both bottom up and top down. As I mentioned, we did a 600-person retrospective. This top down represents a product portfolio governance process that we put in place where every 3 months or so, the overall board would look at what was coming up in the roadmap, and they would validate authority to the product owner. So the product owner had a clear amount of responsibility, and it was made clear through this meeting. We invited all of these different parts of the company into the training and into the transformation. We did product roadmap mapping with innovation games, and we used the benefits of LeSS, a single backlog, a single product owner, a single sprint, and cadence to simplify the organizational's processing, how they work.
How big the picture was? How big the organization was?
The organization has different parts. It has regions and a global presence, and 150 people in Poland, and a lot more than that globally. Yes?
And how much time did it take to do?
It took, I started in May. We did training, so there was a fair amount of preparation work because we did some changes in sites. We did some changes in responsibilities. It took about 2 months to get all of that preparation done from a kind of personal standpoint. Then we began training, informed consent, defining the product, grooming the product owner, grooming the backlog, doing the product roadmap session. That was by September. Immediately in the beginning of October, we started the cadence sprint, continued coaching through the end of the year, into the beginning of the next year. So 8 to 10 months, I was on site 20 to 30% of the time. And then there were a team of coaches also that were working with me. So I was coaching the coach as well as coaching people in other roles.
And how did it work with different mentalities in terms of national differences between?
Well, they were pretty much all Polish, the people there, mostly all Polish. And I don't speak Polish, so from my standpoint, it worked well. I feel like I have some good friends from that group. The fact that the local coaches were Polish and were speaking Polish made it a lot easier for them to coach teams. The management was mostly multinational, and I felt like we formed a really tight team. So the strong support of the CTO, the COO, the Chief Product Officer, and the acting head of HR was great. We basically had a small management group that were leading and supporting change, and then an operational layer of people who were in charge of product management, in charge of engineering, who worked on a more operational level.
And what kind of products was it?
FinTech, financial technology product.
What was it? Like in-house applications or products for clients?
Products for clients. Yeah, a products company. And I've run out of time, and I've finished the presentation. I ran over a couple minutes. I apologize. So if you're considering adopting LeSS, I'm glad to help with it. That's my contact information. That's my Twitter handle. That's one easy way to get a hold of me. And if you're interested in getting training, like the one we did this last week, there's a certified LeSS practitioner, a certified LeSS executive session. And we've decided to do another LeSS practitioner in Warsaw in September with Tomek and Procognita. It was a good experience this week. We also realized there are some things we can improve, but it was a good experience that we both want to do it again. There's also innovation games training. And that's it. So thank you for the attention, especially on a sunny afternoon. It's quite a commitment to be inside. And this was a little long. I hope it was okay for you. But thanks a lot. If you have more questions, I think we'll have a chance to talk during the day.